In this video, we'll be diving into some of the features of the Fastify web framework. We'll learn how we can use them to add REST API routes to a Platformatic application. Here we have a basic Platformatic application. We've got Platformatic installed as a dependency in our project. We have a Platformatic DB configuration file, which has got everything set up pointing to our database. And we've got a plugin, which we can see over here. And that at the moment doesn't have any functionality in it. It's just logging out a log message when the plugin is loaded. Now let's go ahead and start up our server. And once it's loaded up, we can then actually click through to this page, this URL here, and load that up in our browser. So here in our browser, we can actually take a look at the OpenAPI documentation. Now this has been automatically generated off the top of the OpenAPI specification that Platformatic DB creates on top of our entities. So it's mapped all the entities in our database, in this case movies, and it's gone and actually created this OpenAPI specification here, which we're seeing in Swagger UI. So we can see all the different routes, the methods, and the type of data. We've got the schema here for movies, so we know what types our different properties inside the movies require. Now to go ahead and extend this API that's Platformatic DB has automatically generated for us, we're going to head back into our editor here, and we're going to then, after the plugin's loaded, we're going to define a new route. So we'll make this a get route, and this is going to be return a count of the movies, so the number of movies that we have in the database. So we need to pass an async function. This is going to be our handler function, and that's going to be triggered when a request comes through to this route, and we've got the request and the response objects that we can work with. And this is a Fastify route handler because we're creating this inside a Fastify plugin. So we've got Platformatic entities, and our movie entity is available, and we can actually call the count method, and we've then got that count value coming back from our database. So we can then return it here with movies count, and we can save that. Now if we go back to our server over here, we can see our plugin has reloaded, and we can then go ahead and actually make a request to that with curl. So our new route is movies count, and we can see that it returns that movies count in an object, and we've got 4 movies in our database. So that's how we actually can go ahead and add a new get route. You'll see here that we're using return to return this object, and Fastify under the hood is automatically serializing that into JSON for us. It's effectively a shortcut for writing response.send. So if we do response.send movies count and head back here and then run that request again, we'll see we get the same response. Well, we can wrap it here in an object to get exactly the same response. And it's the same kind of thing. So we can have a shorter way of doing that is with return rather than using response.send. Now, if we actually go and take a look back in our browser, and we refresh here, we'll see that that new movies count route that we've added into our API is showing up. But it doesn't actually show us what kind of response that we're going to get back. It just says default response 200. So there's no additional information. Whereas if we look at this one here for get movies ID, we'll see that it shows us the type of response we can expect, the schema for that particular one, which is a movie. So let's go ahead and actually add a response schema for our get route. And we can do that over here by adding an object here where we say we're going to have a schema, and this will be our response schema. And this is going to be for the 200 status code. So when everything's okay, that's the HTTP status code. And so let's space this out a little bit so we've got a bit more space to work with everything. And inside of this schema, what we're going to specify is the actual structure of the data that we're going to be sending back. Now, doing this allows us to make sure that we only send through the fields that we actually expect, and that we're not accidentally sending data that we don't mean to. But also it means that we get the benefit of being able to see in our Swagger UI, in our Open API spec, what data will come back from this endpoint. So we're going to be returning an object, and it's going to have a single property, and that's going to be movies count. And that's going to have a type of integer. And then we can save that. And if we actually see everything's reloaded here, let's just test our root still working. So we're still getting back that movies count with the actual count value. And if we head back into our browser and refresh now, we can take a look at the movies count root, and we'll see that we've got now an actual schema. And so it shows us the example value that will be coming back. So we've got a fully documented API root. So it gives us a more complete open API spec and better Swagger UI documentation by adding in this response schema. And as mentioned, it allows us to control the data that's sent in the response and ensure that we don't accidentally send back fields that we don't mean to. And it actually can help speed up the serialization of the response data that's sent back, because it allows Fastify to optimize the response that's sent through. We've created a get root, and now we're going to go ahead and add a post root to our API. So this post root will accept some data, and it's going to accept a movie. And what we're going to do is actually transform that movie and the name of it and make it uppercase. So it'll be a loud movie. So we've got our response handler here, which we can actually have triggered when the loud movies root is called. And we're going to take the request body, which is going to be the movie that's being passed through in the post data. And for now, we're just going to return an empty object. So this data here that we're going to have coming in, this request body, we want to actually validate it. That's kind of the first line of security that we should be adding into our API routes, is actually validating the data. And we can do this with a schema. So this is a validation schema. And here we're going to reference an existing schema. When Platformatic DB maps our database tables, in this case it's mapped the movies table, it's generated a schema. And that schema defines the properties that are available. We can actually see that schema down here in our Swagger UI. So we'll have ID, title, and year, and it's got all the different types for those fields. So this is the schema we're going to be using to validate the incoming request body. We also want to go ahead and add a schema for the response, for when the actual response gets sent back to the user. And this is similar to what we did on the previous route. And we're going to say for the 200 HTTP status code, we're going to be serializing the response again as a movie with all those same fields. So we set things up that our schema is expecting to validate a movie coming in as the request body, and the response for the 200 HTTP status code will be again a movie object. Now that we've got that set up and we can be confident in the data that's coming through, let's go ahead and actually modify the movie title that's coming in. And so this is where we're going to make it a loud movie. We're going to convert it to uppercase. And then we can go ahead and actually save that into our database. So we're going to use the Platformatic SQL mapper, which actually exposes all the entities that it's mapped for us. So in this case, we're going to be using the movie entity. And then we can save that movie object that will be brought through here, which has come through in the request body. We've transformed the name, and then we'll be saving that into our database. So once that's saved, we can then go ahead and actually return the result object that comes back from our database. So this is all built on top of the SQL mapper that Platformatic DB exposes. Now, if we go ahead and actually refresh in our browser, we'll see that we've got this brand new loud movies route, and it has a full example request body here. So we can see the ID, the title, and the year. And it shows us that's using the movie schema. And we can also see the response that will come back too. We can go ahead and actually try it out directly here in the UI. So let's remove that ID because that will get automatically generated for us. And we're going to say, we're going to pick favorite movie, Toy Story 3. I'm not quite sure on the year, but let's imagine that it was 2020. It's definitely a bit later than that, but let's execute that. And if we actually take a look now, we'll see the response that's come back from our API. So we can see we've got that uppercase movie that's been, that title that's been put into the database. So we've got that full response for the movie. So that data has been validated, and we can be confident that the data that's going into our database is what we expect it to be. Here we've seen what we can do in terms of adding custom REST API routes to our API, and how adding validation and response schemas actually allow us to not only be confident about the data we're receiving and that we're sending, but also adding improved Open API spec and a better Swagger UI so that we've got a better documented API.